Welcome to the forecast. We're really excited today to have John DiMartino from the Crumdale Partners Group talking about misalignment of incentives and employer-based health insurance. The lack of transparency and the misalignment of incentives really are things that drive employers crazy. Quite frankly, it drives us in the business crazy. And so today what we'd like to do is maybe peel back the curtain a little bit and talk about some of the ways they get you. And we'll be talking about 4 key issues and a bonus issue that you might want to be aware of going into 2021 as an employer. The first thing that really comes to mind for me is that, few people would argue that health insurance and this system isn't really working well for employers or employees. What would you say is the primary reason or the biggest reason for that growing dissatisfaction?
Sure. Great question, Quattro. And I think the easiest way to answer the question is by first talking about who the system does work for, right? Because you hit it right on the head. For employers and for employees, it's not so great. But if you're an insurance company, a pharmacy benefit manager, a drug company, a drug manufacturer, the system's working out pretty well. If we took a look at the total returns on stock prices for publicly traded health insurance companies from 2010 to current, you would see that the returns for United Healthcare are over 1,000%, Cigna's over 500%, and Anthem is over 500%. When you compare that to the S&P 500 total return, that's at less than 300%. Right? So the system is working for certain individuals within the healthcare ecosystem. But if you're an employer, one of the most common things that we hear is, these costs are out of control. And if we take a look over a 20-year period or so from 1999 to 2019, what we found is that family premiums have almost quadrupled during that same time. So as an employer, how are you looking at controlling those costs? Well, you're really not, right? We just have to bear that burden. And for most employers at this point, employee benefits is the second or third largest line item on their P&L. Right? There's a Forbes magazine article that referenced that Starbucks pays more for benefits than they do for coffee. That GM spends more on benefits than they do on steel. And Warren Buffett was quoted as saying that GM is a healthcare company with a car company attached. I mean, that's the extent of the cost of employer-sponsored healthcare in this country. And then when we take a look at satisfaction with insurance companies, well, employees get the raw end of the deal, right? Because as brokers, what are we trained to do? Well, we go in, we have a conversation with the employer, we let them know that their rates are going up, and then it's decision time. Do you as the employer eat that cost? Or do we cost shift to the employees? And more often than not, we cost shift to the employees and put them in a high deductible health plan or a health plan that just has a high deductible for medical costs or hospital inpatient or outpatient procedures, right? And most employees would describe the entire ecosystem as confusing, right? When we take a look at, and maybe some of your viewers are familiar with the Net Promoter Score, that's pretty much a gauge of customer satisfaction for pretty much anything in the U.S. So when we take a look at that scale, it goes up to 100, right? And the average Net Promoter Score for an insurance company, take a guess.
50.
Negative 20. Right? And the most common negative emotion was confusion, right? Because health insurance offers what we'll talk about as we move through this podcast, a truly baffling experience to the customers that they purport to represent. And one of the other big reasons, and because of the consolidation, hospital systems and healthcare providers can typically hide their pricing, right? There is no pricing transparency.
Right.
And Quattro, you and I both know that there's a tremendous variability in pricing, right? So if you walk into a standalone clinic to get an MRI, one of the ones that you just see right off the highway, your health plan may pay $800 towards that MRI. But if you go to a hospital for the same MRI with the same machine, and I've, no exaggeration, seen a $40,000 charge for that same MRI that cost $800 down the street. The average person has no idea this type of pricing variability occurs. And when I tell people that this happens, they don't believe me, right? That's usually the resistance is, well, that can't possibly be true. right? But what have we asked employees to do, Quattro? We've asked them to shop around, right? We've put them in high deductible health plans. And we said, you need to get out there and determine, where the lowest costs are, because now you have skin in the game, right? And I'm sure you've done this a million times, right? Called a hospital or a provider or a doctor or an MRI center just to ask them, hey, listen, with this Blue Cross Blue Shield or UHC or Cigna PPO discount, how much is it going to cost, right?
Yeah.
And it's an absolute nightmare. If you call 5 different times, you'll get 5 different answers. The only thing that those calls will have in common is an extremely long wait time and a ton of confusion at best, right? And maybe you walk away with an estimate of the price you might pay.
CuatroBenefits is dedicated to bringing the power and leverage of large employers to companies with just 20 employees and up. Sign up for our interactive webinar at the link in the description of this video, and we'll show you approaches that have worked with many other small and mid-sized employers. Enjoy the rest of the video.
We've heard a lot through healthcare reform and everything else about this concept on the insurance side of things of medical loss ratio. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you might be able to sort of explain to the layperson, what is that and why does it matter?
Definitely. So when we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, which is quite ironically named, right, we just went through what the returns were for insurance companies, right? So anybody who thinks that that law was geared more towards consumers than it was to protect insurance companies, I mean, the proof is in that total returns on the stock prices, right? But one of the provisions that's probably one of the most powerful misaligned incentives that exist in healthcare today is what's called the medical loss ratio provision of the Affordable Care Act, right? And for those of you watching who don't know, the medical loss ratio provision basically states that insurance premium health insurance company charges, the health insurance company can take no more than 20% of the premium as revenue for itself, right? So revenue is tied to premium, right? So that means higher premiums equal more revenue, right? So let's dive a little bit deeper.
Well, let me interrupt you real quick.
Sure.
So if you're saying 20% goes to their revenue, then the assumption is the other 80% goes to pay for the claims cost of taking care of the members. Is that correct?
Exactly. That would be correct.
Okay.
Right. And one of the things that they tried to accomplish with the medical loss ratio provision was protecting consumers, right? So that way an insurance company couldn't unjustifiably raise the premium, right? In order to do that, the claims would have to rise. Now, one of the issues that we just talked about consolidation in the marketplace. One of the issues that we have is there's opaque pricing. There's no transparency. There's a lot of different ways where health plans squeeze money out of the different vendors that work for them to increase costs, right? Because if the only way I can increase your premium is if I can justify it with an increase in costs, well, what do you think I'm going to do?
Yeah,
right.
You're going to find ways to do that.
Exactly, and I'll give you a couple examples. So first and foremost, when we're a hospital system and we're negotiating our contract with a health insurance company, right? We don't negotiate the starting price and negotiate a discount off of a starting price that we agree on. All we do is negotiate a discount, right? So maybe it's a 50% discount or 60% discount. But the leverage that the hospital has is, well, maybe it's 50% off of a $10,000 charge. Maybe it's 50% off of $50,000 charge. That's completely up to me, the hospital system, as to where I want to start that price, right? And as a hospital system, obviously the higher the cost is, the more money that we make. And the higher the cost is, the more insurance premium that the insurance company can charge. So there's a very wacky misaligned incentive there to have costs continue to drive, to continue to increase.
Is that a little bit like fox guarding the hen house? If you get to name your price without really being checked on that?
Definitely. And you would look anywhere else in this country and you would expect there to be some sort of laws or guidance or something that protects consumers, right? Particularly from these outrageous prices. But even, I'll give you another really good example, right? The pharmacy drugs that are allowed to be filled under your health plan, they're typically known as drugs that are, quote, on your formulary, right?
Right.
Let's say we have two drugs and clinically they do the exact same thing, but one of them costs $100 a month. The other one costs $2,000 a month, right? Your health plan can set it up so only one of them is covered under your plan. Now, if we're looking at cost and quality, you would take the one that costs $100, right? But our incentive isn't to control cost. Our incentive is to increase it. So what do you think most health plans do when faced with that challenge,
They're
right?
not going to cover the low cost one.
Exactly, right? And while they both may have a very similar clinical outcome, the mindset is that we're going to go with this one because it's going to drive up claims cost.
So if minimum loss ratio was the strategy to sort of squeeze the balloon, if you will, to keep those costs in line, the net result has been when you squeeze that balloon, you get a lot of things that may come out either end. And that's really been the carrier's response and the hospitals and the providers' response to say, well, we need to get ours, and we may have to get it out of the prescribed range of this minimum loss ratio, or just increase the total size of the pie from which we're dividing.
Exactly. And it's certainly, at least I hope, an unintended consequence passing this provision within the Affordable Care Act. But unfortunately, it's certainly the way things are going now, right? And I don't want to necessarily paint everybody as a bad actor, but to a certain extent, everybody is doing what you would expect them to do,
Right.
given the financial incentives that they have built into the healthcare ecosystem.
Okay. And that's the system with fully insured health plans. And the vast majority of small employers and smaller employers in America who have group health insurance are on fully insured health plans.
Mm-hmm.
Does it work the same way for the larger companies that are doing things in the realm of the self-funded world? Are they subject to the same type of MLR or anything like that?
No, this is really for fully insured companies, right? So once you flip the switch to self-funded, then you're in a completely different arena, right? Because at that point, you're no longer asking an insurance company to predict what your claims are going to be. You've hired an independent actuary, or your broker has hired an independent actuary who's going to determine what your expected claims are going to be, and then they're going to build an insurance program around that. So to a certain extent, this really affects those small and mid-market groups a lot more than it affects those Fortune 100, 2,000, 5,000 groups, right? Because they tend to be self-funded.
Now, another big one, and this one is important to me, has to do with the alignment of incentives with regard to brokers and consultants and advisors. And, there are times when if I'm a broker and I have a commission that's paid to me by the carrier for my client's health plan, and that commission is a percentage,
Mm-hmm.
and they get a 10 or a 15 or a 20% increase at their renewal. If I come to them and say, oh, I really feel your pain,
Mm-hmm.
do I? Because I just got a raise. And I'm curious your thought on the way that is structured and what the impact of that kind of misalignment can be.
And there's certainly a misaligned incentive there. If we rewind to the dawn of employer-sponsored healthcare, a commission-based structure made sense, right? Life insurance was on a similar subject. Voluntary benefits were on a similar commission schedule.
Right.
And when the premiums were low, it made sense. It's an easy way to compensate what I would call a producer of that service for their time and energy that they spent, producing it. When we fast forward and we see the outrageous spikes in the cost of healthcare, over the last 50 years and really over the last 20, that commission-based structure doesn't make a ton of sense anymore, right? When we're battling 1% inflation or inflation that's along with CPI, totally understandable. But when our medical trend is between 5 and 15% year in and year out, well, it's a little bit different story now, right? And the other thing that's becoming troubling is with that compensation schedule, you do have a financial incentive for the cost to increase every year, right? And you also know that undoubtedly the costs are going to increase every year. But the person who's hired you which is the person that most brokers purport to work for, which is the downstream client, the employer, well, what are their incentives, right? What do they want? I guarantee if you ask them, almost all of them would say, I want to offer better benefits and I want to offer them for a lower cost, right? That's what they want you to do as the broker. But more often than not, most brokers don't have the ability to manage those claims. I mean, they do the best they can with the tools that they're given, which are shopping the insurance, trying to cost shift or raise deductibles, or try and implement some sort of steerage, or maybe they think even implementing a wellness program is a good idea, right? That's the tools that they're given. And unfortunately, I think the reason why more brokers don't look outside of those basic tools is because there's no incentive for them to do so. If they transition from fully insured to a self-funded organization, well, typically there's not a percentage commission built in anymore. Usually it's a per employee per month fee or some sort of flat fee. And maybe in this arrangement, it's no longer the insurance company paying you. Maybe it's the employer cutting you a check directly, right? And maybe if you're a broker, the money that you're making on some of these accounts, you're almost embarrassed to tell your client about, right? Because you pull up in a nicer and nicer car every year, and the employer is looking at a 10, 20, 30% rate hike. So
Right.
along those lines, having some transparency there certainly helps. Having a broker consultant who's going to align themselves with your goals as the employer helps. And that's really the first step in fixing this problem, is finding someone who's willing to roll up their sleeves, has access to the innovative type of solutions that exist in this marketplace today, and meet your employer's objectives, which are typically better benefits at a lower cost.
So, what is a better model for compensating advisors? If a percentage commission obviously is flawed, well, what's a better way to go about this?
Sure. There's two general ways that come into mind. One is a per employee per month fee. So quick example, if you have 100 employees enrolled on the health plan and you have let's call it $20 per employee per month fee, then every month you'll get $20 for each person, 20 times 100, 2,000. So throughout the year, you'll make $24,000. Now that might be a little bit low for a 100 employee group, but you get the idea. Now you know what the broker's making as the employer. You're comfortable with that amount. You may have even talked about it for the first time ever. And there's a lot of transparency there. And now next year, if your rates go up 30%, well, maybe I'm still making that same $20 per employee per month fee that I was making last year. Or maybe we've built in some sort of COLA adjustment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's option number one. Option number two is just a flat fee, right? So me as your employer, you have 100 employees. Listen, the time and energy I need to put into doing this, to proactively managing your health plan and to doing all the other wonderful things that we do, it's going to cost $50,000, right? So why don't we cut that up into 12 installments, and every month I'll send you an invoice, you'll send me the payment, right? Doesn't get much more transparent than that, particularly because it's money that's coming right out of the employer's pocket, right? So to the extent that the broker is doing a great job, more than happy to cut the check. But if they're not doing a great job, now there's a little bit more accountability, right? So in that sense, if I'm the employer, I have more control, and I can tell you, if you're not working in my best interest, well, I'm going to stop paying you and bring somebody else in to do it, right? So there's a little bit more accountability there. And along those lines, the broker may have a little bit more of an incentive to step outside the box and find some ways to mitigate costs.
Well, and that's really what interests most of our clients is what can you do to add value? What can you do to lower my overall costs?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really in that employer's best interest to at least know, what am I paying you? And too often in this line of work, it's, oh, don't worry, it's all baked into the total. Oh, don't worry about that. You don't pay me, which is very different than, how much are you making on this?
Right.
And even more to the point, hey, are you telling me you want me to take this carrier and this plan because it's the best thing for me? Or is this going to help you win that trip to Cabo?
Right.
Or a big bonus? And really something that's just as simple as, I'm going to talk to you about what I charge and how we earn it. and let you decide, do you want to pay me for those services, and then decide, did I do a good job or not? Makes a lot of sense. And furthermore, if you've got a company that's growing, I would assume that charging a fee for service allows me as an advisor to say to the client, hey, you're growing. I need to charge you less per employee because you're growing so much. I can't justify these fees. And, flip the script a little bit and say, look, my goal is to drive my income lower per capita and do an even better job for you.
Quadro, I don't want to confuse two things, right? Because when somebody thinks about this, they think, well, maybe the broker with the consulting fee or the per employee per month fee is going to arbitrarily be less than someone charging commission. And while it is true that it could be less than the commission, and there's typically no carrier bonus program or carrier override associated with it, I think the forward-looking brokers should be charging as much, if not even more in some instances, than what their counterparts are charging, right? Because if now you have somebody that's going to control your costs and let's say reduce them by even 20%, right? Wouldn't you be willing to pay that broker a little bit more money to do that rather than pay somebody whatever the insurance company says you should pay them for doing a job that, could be done a lot better? That's just my opinion, right?
Well, at the end of the day, if you can't get that client to the place they need to be, then you really don't deserve the business. So at the end of the day, it's performance. Did you help me manage this better? And at least you know exactly what you're paying, and there's a transparency there, and it's alignment of incentives. I don't have any reason to benefit if your costs go up on the whole. Okay, I think that's just hugely important and really been absent from for quite some time. The other thing that really comes to mind is I get this all the time. When somebody has a renewal, trying to understand the reason behind that increase. You got a 10% increase. And the hardest question to answer is the most basic one: why? I'm curious your thoughts on, what we hear and maybe what might be some reasons we're not hearing for these hikes.
Sure. First and foremost, these ridiculous rate hikes have been normalized, right? So healthcare's big lie is that you can't control your claims cost, right? And Quattro, I'm here to tell you and the viewers and everybody watching that they can absolutely take control of their healthcare spend. But before we dive into that, let's a quick recap of why costs going up every year is so believable, right? So employers are used to increasing costs. Healthcare costs have risen pretty much every year since the dawn of employer-sponsored healthcare, right? It's normalized. The organization that's supposed to control your costs, or at least your hospital costs, your health insurance company, has a wacky financial incentive for premiums to increase, as we discussed. The organization that's supposed to control prescription drug costs, PBMs, has a financial incentive for a cost to increase. And the entity that you've hired to control your costs, your broker, has a financial incentive for premiums to increase. Right? So when somebody asks me why costs keep going up, it's because every single person except the employer and the employees has a vested interest in costs continuing to rise. Right? So as an employer, the chips are certainly stacked against you. Right? And what if the employer's been told, your claims are too high. You have several high claimants. You need to implement a high deductible health plan. Your employees need skin in the game. You need to implement a wellness program, right? And where has that gotten us, right? We're absolutely no better off now than when we started this whole mess all those years ago, right? And employees are taking an absolute beating, right? Because we're just looking at cost shifting to them more often than not, right? So from 2009 to 2019, deductibles have risen over 162%, which is outrageous, right? Family premiums during that same time have increased over 54%. Workers' earnings have increased about 26%, and inflation has increased about 20%. So if I am a worker who's offered employer-sponsored healthcare, my entire raise for at least the last 20 years has been essentially eroded by the increase in cost of my healthcare. And sometimes that's direct. I can look at my paycheck and say I'm paying more. And sometimes it's looking at my paycheck and saying I'm paying more, and then looking at your plan design and saying I'm getting less, right? So it can be a little bit tough to tackle from that regard. But let me throw a couple more things out there, right? The average American has about $700 or $800 in their bank account, right? So the average deductible for a high deductible health plan is at least about $1,350, I believe, this year. So can't cover the deductible right off the bat. Even worse if you have family coverage, right? And now you might have to pony up $2,600, $2,700. When we're taking a look at how this is affecting employees in a high deductible health plan, most studies that have come out suggest that employees aren't becoming consumers, right? Because they have no way of being able to figure out cost or quality, as we talked about a little bit earlier, right? So instead, what they do is what they've always done. They go wherever, right? It's kind of a hodgepodge with no real thought as to where they're going or why they're going there. And as we saw with the pricing variability, you can screw that up pretty bad, pretty easy, right? All it takes is one MRI that costs 10 grand or 20 grand, or one radiologist who's out of network to completely blow up your finances, right? And because of items similar to that, in 2019, medical debt became the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States, overtaking credit card debt, right? And the biggest shock is that 3/4 of the people who declared bankruptcy had insurance. Their deductibles and their copays and the balance billing just happened to be so high and so egregious that they had no choice but to file bankruptcy. And that is one of the biggest issues that we have in healthcare and health insurance today.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, that's a huge threat to the middle class. And the very thing that's supposed to be that protection in the case of some catastrophic medical situation isn't even enough to be that protection. I mean, and it's not really the safety net we built it up to be. So I've heard a lot of doom and gloom there, but you also started by saying employers really can control costs and really can change the dynamic. How do they go about doing that?
You know, it sounds easier than it is, right? And the fix is you just have to start aligning all those misaligned incentives. And then you're going to see as an employer that things start working out for you, right? So the first thing an employer can do to start addressing this egregious pricing and these egregious prices is first, just find a broker who's willing to align themselves with your goals. Okay, so somebody who's willing to maybe take on a flat fee or a per employee per month fee, or somebody who's willing to have a flat fee in a bonus program if they reduce your total spend by 10%, 20%, 30%, right? So that's first step, is the person who you've trusted to represent you, make sure that they're aligned to represent you in the way that you want them to. That's number one, okay? Then the second step, and for some employers, I get a lot of pushback because they're a little afraid of going this route, but let that broker who you've trusted and who's aligned with you and their actuaries and their underwriting team identify whether or not a self-funded program makes sense for your organization. You know, for most of the people watching or listening, it's going to make sense because there's going to be a way to reduce costs year over year, right? So if that is the case, then transition from a fully insured program to a self-funded program, right? And if you're apprehensive, the broker's going to walk you through, or at least a good broker, all of the pros and cons, show you how your cash flow might be affected, show you where it's going to be positively affected, and then walk you through some of the unique cost containment programs that are available, as well as some of the data analytics programs that are available. So for really you as the broker to go out and proactively manage the health plan, right? So find a broker who's aligned with you, let them determine whether or not a self-funded program makes sense, and then empower that broker to do what they're supposed to do, which is align themselves with your goals, which I'm willing to guess are drive down my costs, right? And find a way to enhance the benefits. That's how we start fixing healthcare in the United States.
I'm curious, as we look forward into 2021, What do you see? I mean, we're in a very unusual year, to say the least, with a pandemic. But what do you see happening generally in the marketplace? And we can start with the fully insured market, which is where a lot of companies are right now, and then maybe talk a little bit about the self-funded world, what you expect in the next 6 months.
Right. Well, it wouldn't be a 2020 podcast without talking about COVID-19, right?
Of course.
In the answer that I'll provide, we have to think back just for a moment to the medical loss ratio, right? So talking about 80% of the premium needs to be spent on claims, right? So that's paramount to what I'm going to say next. In 2020, because of the coronavirus pandemic, many people who would have had elective procedures, let's call them a knee surgery, an elbow surgery, pretty much anything that's not immediately life-threatening has been postponed, right? And that's where about 30% or so of healthcare spend is. That's also where a lion's share of hospital revenue is, okay? So because of coronavirus, there haven't been as many bodies and beds at a hospital, right? So hospitals are making way less money, right? And health plans aren't paying as much in claims, right? Because people are just waiting to get the care that they need until things lighten up a little bit, right? So because of COVID kind of hit the pause button on that claims activity, if you are a fully insured entity, right, your premium is no longer going to be justified by the claims that were paid this year, right? So at the end of 2020, insurance companies are going to have to comply with the medical loss ratio, and they're going to say, okay, well, we charged $1 billion in premium for all of Texas, let's say, and we really thought that we were going to pay $800 million in claims. We only paid $700 million in claims, right? So I can't keep that delta as an insurance company, right? So I have to give some of that back to the employers that we represent. So if you've seen some insurance companies have proactively given money back to some of the employers, some are waiting to see how the MOR shakes out. But the idea is that they didn't justify their medical loss ratio, right? So they're going to have to give some money back. Now, what's going to happen in 2021? Well, just because in 2020, those people weren't getting their knee surgeries and elbow surgeries and other elective procedures doesn't mean they're not going to get them, right? The idea is that wave is going to be pushed. So now in 2021, there may be another 800 million in expected claims, but now that 100 million that didn't get them in 2020 is going to hit in 2021. So we fully expect that the insurance companies are going to adjust by raising the premium to make sure they're still operating in that medical loss ratio. So because of COVID, 2020 claims are artificially low. 2021 claims are going to be artificially high, and your premium is going to reflect that.
Okay, so good news, maybe you get a dividend for 2020. Bad news, you're going to get walloped on renewal rates going into 21 and beyond.
Exactly. Now, if you are a self-funded employer, one of the really nice things about what's happening in 2020 right now is that all of the claims get paid out of your general asset fund, right? A little bank account that we set up for the employer, right? So to the extent that people aren't getting their elective procedures simply means that the employer holds on to that money, right? In a very low interest bearing account. So whether or not it's 2020 or 2021, we've already funded those claims. So to the self-funded employer, it doesn't matter if they're getting their knee surgery July of 2020 or August of 2021. It doesn't matter, right? Because we've already funded it. It's in the claims fund, and it just rolls over from year to year. So to the extent that there's changes or variability in claims, we expect that anyway. So self-funded employers are just seeing more and more money stay within their organization today. And for a lot of self-funded employers, especially those who have taken some haymakers because of COVID, keeping an extra 10, 20, 100,000, $1 million within their organization is extremely beneficial.
I can see that. So I guess really kind of one of the most fundamental aspects of self-funding is, compared to fully insured, what might have been the profits for the insurance carrier is simply what stays in your coffers.
Mm-hmm.
And in the event of a really, really bad year with super high claims, you've already gone out and reinsured that risk, so you know exactly what your maximum risk is, and you're not as worried about that bad year because you've got that backstop. And that's something that a lot of employers may have questions about. And really, as we wrap up, we've talked about a lot of things here today
Mm-hmm.
to the problems in the existing system as we know it. And really, this is more of a teaser for a webinar that we'll be doing, because we'd like to take all the themes that we cover today and each of the pieces that go together to put together an employer-based health plan and say, okay, how do we do it right? How do we do this correctly to align the incentives and to squeeze out the fat and to really make this work well for an employer for the long haul, something that you can budget off of, something that's sustainable, something that won't force you to jump from one carrier to the next every few years, and drag your employees along with that whiplash while you're doing it.
Exactly, Quattro. And I'm really excited to have that webinar with you because the program that you've built really does a few things. It provides transparency with all of the different vendors that make up the healthcare program. It provides accountability because now we have a contract that states what they're supposed to do and what all those prices are supposed to be. So to the extent that they're not doing it, you can run point and fix the issue. Or if the vendor simply isn't working, replace them with somebody else. And that's going to drive control over the program, which is of paramount importance to you as the broker, right? And eventually that's going to lead to lower costs. Right now, the program that you built is wonderful because it provides those small and mid-market employers with an awful lot of the same protections that a fully insured program has. But because of the transparency, because of the accountability, because of the ability to control and mitigate risk, they're in a situation where 60 days out of renewal, you're not going to come to them and say, it's another 30%. Sorry, guys. Instead, You're going to be in a position to say, well, listen, these are the 3 or 4 things that we did throughout the year to help mitigate costs. This is what the ROI was. Moving into 2021 or 2022 or whatever it is, the next renewal. These are the things, maybe the 3 or 4 things that I want you to consider as the employer that we may implement to further drive down costs, right? And that is a conversation, Quattro, that I think too few people are having with their brokers, and something that, I'm really excited that you're bringing to the marketplace.
There's really only so much we can cover here, so we hope you'll join us for a webinar where we may be able to dive a little deeper into this to show you as an employer how you can self-fund to drive a high level of transparency and to reduce your costs. So if you're an employer with 25 or more employees, please join us. We'll have links to the webinar registration on this video as well as on the website. I think it'll be a great use of your time. Excellent. Well, JD, we really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the forecast. And until we meet again, everybody stay safe.
Thank you. Take care.